Hi everybody, Dan Bailey here on the shores of Colony Glacier and Lake George. I'm practicing some good social distancing, as you can see. I wish you were here with me, be able to shoot photos of this amazing location, but obviously that's not the case right now. And so for today's lesson, I decided to do a little mini photo workshop. So my idea for today is to explore this little area just right here along the bank. And so what I'll do is I'll just kind of walk around and look at the scene, and I'll pick things out. We'll work a few different subjects. And so I'll pick a few scenes out. And so you'll be able to see how I work, how I kind of gauge the scene, what attracted me to that particular viewpoint, and how I deal with the compositional challenges to make that an effective picture. So I'll talk about which lenses I'm going to use. I've got 4 different lenses with me: the Fuji 14-2.8, the 35 f2, the 50 f2, and the 50-140. So I try to use each one of those at least once. And so you'll be able to get a feel for how I use my lenses as well. And I think that's a really important part of photography is learning how to see through each type of lens. Another thing to keep in mind is, the light's not spectacular right now. It's just kind of an overcast midday scene. And I think that's a good exercise because it's often easy to shoot in magic hour. You just point your camera at the beautiful light and get a great photo. I think there's more of a challenge when you have less than dynamic light. And so that'll factor into the equation too, is how can I use this type of light to produce a scene that actually looks dramatic and dynamic in the finished image. I'll also use some of the different Fujifilm simulations so you can see how that affects the photo as well. And I'll also make use of some of the creative tools that I've been talking about in my most recent lessons, like highlight tone, shadow tone, color, things like that. So let's get started. I'll just start with my wide angle, my 14 millimeter, and we'll just kind of walk around and see what catches my eye. So as I walk along the bank here, one of the first things that catches my eye is this little line of small ice chunks that runs back to this bigger iceberg and then back to the mountain. So let's see what we can do with this scene. Now I often shoot handheld because I like to travel light and fast, but I do occasionally use a tripod. I won't use one here because the tripod's holding the video camera. But in a situation like this, the tripod does offer more stability, especially with longer lenses. And also, when you put the camera on the tripod, it allows you to just kind of step away and think. You don't have to concentrate on holding it. You can just kind of step away and look at the scene, engage what's going on. So it just allows you to work a little more comfortably and a little more slowly and deliberately. And anytime you're putting more deliberate thought into your photography, chances are you're going to make a better picture. So the first thing we need to figure out is what's going to be in the frame. And so when I look at this, my eye catches this pile of rocks here, these little jumble of boulders, and then I have that bigger iceberg in the background, and then the mountain in the distance. And so using those 3 elements, I can create this kind of trio of anchors that helps to draw the eye and direct the eye across the frame and through the picture. So one of the key elements of wide-angle lenses is the closer you are to your subject, the more that subject is accentuated in the frame. And oftentimes we'll use this technique to accentuate the foreground. So for example, I could shoot the rocks, I could kind of frame from a little ways back and get an effect that looks like this. But if I move in more closely, I can increase the relative size of the rocks in the foreground, and that helps to create a more dramatic entry into the photo. It brings your eye right into the scene. Another consideration to make is whether you're going to shoot from a higher vantage point or a lower vantage point. And when I'm shooting with a low vantage points, oftentimes I'll flip the screen up on my X-series cameras, and so it just makes it easier to see the screen rather than trying to look through the viewfinder really low. But the visual effect of a high vantage point versus low vantage point can make a big difference in this scene. You can see with a lower vantage point, you have a much more intimate looking scene. The foreground stands out more prominently. But you tend to lose some of that front to back depth that you get with a higher vantage point. And so that's where you'll just have to make the decision is what kind of image are you going to go for, what look. And so you might find a middle ground where you retain that front to back depth, but you still retain that level of intimacy with the dramatic subject in your foreground. For this scene, I think I prefer a little bit less of the front and back depth in exchange for the drama of the foreground. I think that rocks makes for a nice strong entry subject into the frame, and it contrasts nicely with the other 2 strong elements we have in the back of the frame. And you can see how slight variations in your composition can make for a very different feel for the photograph. And so that's why you want to always experiment. You know, move back and forth a little bit, up and down, front to back. You know, change vantage points and just put some variations into your looks until you find that one that really excites you the most about the scene. And sometimes you may not know what you're going for. You just might stumble upon it, and that's kind of the beauty and the magic of this whole process is you don't always know what you're going to find. And sometimes you look through the viewfinder and, oh, there it is. That's the scene. That's my photo. And then once you've got your composition set, once you've decided on effective framing, then it's a matter of fine-tuning your exposure and tweaking the look of your image. So I'm shooting in JPEG right now. As I've kind of explained in some of my other videos, I really embrace the challenge of getting it in the camera and exercising my creative ideas and creative skills in the moment on location instead of deferring those until I get home and processing on my computer. I'd rather go home with a finished image, and I'd rather spend my time messing with controls here and tweaking the highlight and shadow tone and exposure and that kind of thing. So for this scene, I actually decided to use Acros and shoot in black and white. I think that pulled out a lot more contrast in some of the rocks and the water and the reflections. And sometimes when you switch film simulations, it might affect your composition. It might suddenly affect your framing because you might find something that's actually accentuated more that you want to show, or something that pulls the eye too much. And so you'll want to adjust your framing after you choose your film simulation in some cases. So for this, I decided to use Acros, and I'm a huge fan of the warm cool tones on that. So for this scene, I did a warm cool adjustment of 6 towards the warm side. And here's what it looks like with a cool tone adjustment as well. So for this, I actually went -2 on the shadow tone to kind of pull out a little more detail on that rock. But then I went +2 on the highlight tone to could bring back some of that contrast that I had lost by reducing the shadow tones. And so I'm pretty happy with the shot. You know, we walked here, and just a few minutes later, this is what I've got. And I like that I have a strong foreground. I've got a couple very strong elements in the background that help draw the eye through the frame. And then a nice level of rich contrast between all the reflections and the ice chunks. So yeah, that's how it's done. That's how I work. That's how I roll. So let's switch lenses. Let's go to the 35 f2 and see what else we can get. So let's move on a little bit over here. One thing that's drawing my eye immediately is this reflection. So let's see what we can do with this. Again, with the 35 f2. So I changed my mind. Now that I got down, I actually found this little scene that I like. When I actually looked through the lens, this is what jumped right out at me. And that's often how it works. You might see something, put on a different lens, walk over, and your eye's caught by something else. And that's part of the magic. So when I looked through the viewfinder, what drew me immediately is this dark rock right here, and this log, and a piece of driftwood, and this little horizontal iceberg. And then I can see back to the mountain. So with the 35, I'm going to make use of a more shallow depth of field, and instead of getting sharpness front to back, I'm going to accentuate this foreground subject in sharp focus and have a much softer background. And that's one of the things I love about the 35. And as you get into longer focal lengths, is you can really make use of shallow depth of field and isolate your subject matter with selective focus. I think the selective focus is one of the most powerful techniques in photography. And so I'm going to make use of that with this lens right now. Again, using the Acros film simulation, I'll bring the f-stop down to f4, and that gives a much shallower depth of field. I could even bring it back to f2 and see what we get. That gives a much more shallow depth. Really makes that foreground subject pop against a much softer background. And again, I'm adjusting my vantage points, just moving up and down with slight movements, just to see how the foreground and background fall in relationship with each other when you move the camera. And so for this scene, again, it's Acros film simulation with +2 on the shadow tone to draw out more contrast. And so by contrast, the last scene was -2 on the shadow tone, so we can have a little more definition in that rock, where this scene is +2 on the shadows, because we can get away with the richness and the rich blacks of this subject, and we don't need to see too many details in that one. And just trying a little variation, I switched film simulations and to see what it looked like in color. So here's Provia, then Classic Chrome, Eterna is next, and then here's Velvia. I don't think that looks great. However, when I switched the white balance from auto to shade, the Velvia shot actually looks a lot better. So that's something to keep in mind as well. I usually keep my camera on auto, but if I do make a switch, it's usually to shade if I'm in an overcast scene, and oftentimes that makes a big difference. And here's classic chrome with the shade white balance versus the auto white balance. So I know I said that I had 4 lenses with me, but I'm going to cut this down to 3 for a couple reasons. One, because my phone's running out of battery power, but second of all, because I like the simplicity of thinking in terms of wide, middle, long. In fact, that's the primary way that I like to think about lenses. Wide, middle, long. I've got a wide angle view, I've got a middle, kind of more focused view, and then I've got a telephoto where I'm really compressing the scene in a big way. So wide angle, get a wide depth of field usually. With the middle, I can kind of have this middle ground where I'm, like with a 35, we just had a shallower depth of field. We'll compress that even more with the long lens. I've got the 50 to 140 on my X-T3 here. And so let's quickly see what we can find. So much, I hope I can find something worthy to photograph out here. So just give me a minute while I look around. So we're gonna go back to this reflection. I do like the scene a lot, so I'm gonna see what I can do with the long lens. And in fact, I have something in mind to do this sort of half reflection, where I'm showing the bottom of the scene reflected in the water, but I'm not showing the top of the scene. And that just kind of creates an interesting look. It's a little different. It kind of messes with your brain because you have to figure out what you're looking at. And so I think anytime you kind of confuse the viewer a little bit, then you're on your way to making a successful photo. Because at least they're going to look at it for a little bit longer as they try to figure it out. So in this case, I'm going to juxtapose the icebergs with the bottom of the reflection in the lake. And I won't show the top. And so there's just a lot of really neat geometric stuff going on between the reflection. And I've got clear water right now. The wind was blowing a bit earlier and it was stealing my nice reflection. So I got to quickly get that done. So now I'm just looking for vantage points and playing around with composition, trying to come up with something unique. And so a lot of times it does take walking around a little bit and just exploring the scene, especially when there's so much good stuff to photograph. It can be challenging to narrow that down into a workable, exciting, simple picture. It's a real challenge. I've got the water starting to ripple up a little bit, and I'm being distracted by bush planes overhead, so not easy out here. So I've actually switched my vantage point. Now I'm shooting back this way at these mountains over here. And I think I'm getting some cool stuff. As I said, it can be a real challenge, especially when you have so much really cool stuff. It's hard to narrow down, just pick one thing. I mean, there's that peak right over there. I've shot that numerous times. We can always do this. Here's classic chrome. The +2 on the shadow tone. And switch to acros. And here's kind of a cool look. Eterna with +2 highlight tone, +2 shadow tone, but -4 on the color. So you're increasing the contrast, but pulling the color all the way back. So it's even more towards the monochrome spectrum. I really like that look. Sometimes it takes dialing it all the way until you figure out what you don't like. And then you just start dialing it back until you do like it. So yeah, lots of different variations, lots of things you can do. There's always, we'd spend all day out here, and that's kind of the beauty of it. And now I decided to cheat a little bit. I switched to a new camera. I've got the X100V here, which has the new classic neg film simulation, and I love that look. So here's a couple of examples from that. The first being straight classic neg, and then I bumped the color chrome effect blue up to strong setting. And yeah, I just love this look. I love the way classic neg has this kind of moody, representational, really hard-edged, contrasty look to it. It's just beautiful. I find it works pretty well in overcast situations, which a lot of times the color sims don't look great when it's just drab overcast, but classic neg seems to have a real magic to it. So I hope you enjoyed your little mini workshop out here at the Colony Glacier. I had a fun time doing this. I plan to do some more. So I'd love to hear your comments, give me some feedback, let me know what kind of topics you'd like me to cover in the future, or what specific camera settings or camera techniques you'd like me to cover. So thanks for taking the time to watch this lesson. Be sure and subscribe to my channel. Check out my Fuji ebook, my best-selling guide, X-Series Unlimited. Teaches you everything you need to know in order how to get the best results from your X-Series camera, no matter what model you use. You can find me on social media and on my Patreon page at Dan Bailey Photo. And be sure and visit my website and blog as well. So again, thanks for watching, take care, and I'll see you next time.